All right, folks, I want to try to discuss some of the feedback that I've gotten from some of my more recent videos on Markan Priority. As those who are familiar with this channel, the 15 of you or whatever that actually have subscribed, I appreciate that, by the way. You've seen that I've spent a lot of time focusing on Markan Priority. I think it's an incredibly important issue because so many things in modern biblical scholarship hinge upon it, and that's just not my own words. That's also the words of scholars like Dr. Mark Goodacre. And so I wanted to take this video to discuss in more recent format and in a bit more of a free form format what the problems are with Markan Priority, and use this video also as an invitation to invite those who disagree with what I'm saying here to present the best arguments, because I want to deal with the best arguments. I really don't want to attack straw men. I try very hard not to do that. I think some of the arguments I get in rebuttal are straw men, but that notwithstanding, I do want to invite others to present arguments. So here I'm going to go through a video again from History Valley and Jacob Berman with the professor Frank Hughes, who's a PhD and scholar in the field. Again, I'm not very familiar with Professor Hughes' work. I watched this video. I believe he is someone who actually believes in that Jesus was resurrected, and I believe he is a Christian. So I'm just putting that out there. It doesn't affect what we're talking about here. In fact, his position here is a position that who also identifies as a Christian, disagree with. But I wanted to use his presentation on History Valley as the launch point to discuss some things about Markan Priority. So I'm going to try to do this. I have 3 different screens I'm going to be trying to juggle through here, so just kind of bear with me as I do this.
Church taught otherwise because they were following Augustine, who said that Mark was the abbreviator and the lackey, the sort of petty sequus, the foot follower of Matthew. And so pretty much everybody believed that until 1838. And then in 1838, independently of each other, Christian Hermann Weisse came up with Markan Priority, and also at the same time, the same year, but independently, Christian Gottlob Wilke, who knew a lot of work, by the way. He also argued in favor of Markan Priority.
All right, so I just want to talk here quickly about this framing. I tried to cue the video up earlier. I think right before this, Professor Hughes says that 90% of scholars believe in Markan Priority. I tried to cue that up, but it was missed. It's neither here nor there. I think this is well known that is by far the consensus. But what he says here is that for centuries, Matthew was believed to be first and Mark later because of Augustine. I don't want to nitpick that too much, but that's just not a full view of the historic record. There is patristic testimony, church father testimony that predates Augustine by a few hundred years, or 100 or more years, from Irenaeus of Lyon and Clement of Alexandria, both of whom place Matthew at the very least ahead of Mark, and at least with respect to Irenaeus, ahead of Luke as well. Clement isn't clear as to whether Matthew or Luke came first, but he's clear that both of those, the Gospels with the genealogies, came before Mark. And so I wanted to just talk briefly about just even where we're starting from with respect to the patristic record, because that is the starting point that we need to set as the default here. And I think this is a very important point. we are examining a lot of this work, even as discussed here by Professor Hughes, millennia later, 1700, 1800 years later at the earliest, if not later, from when the original accounts were taken. So, from historical principles, that's long past the proximity window. We have earlier, more proximal testimony from Irenaeus and Clement in particular that gives us the foundation, the default that we should be using, which is that Matthew is first. Now, we are entitled and we're allowed to challenge that, and that is what scholars are doing. No problem with that. That is perfectly fine. We can challenge that and say, no, we don't agree with that for a number of different reasons. But that is the default. And so if we are going to present a different hypothesis, we have to dismantle this default. In other words, our null hypothesis here, for those who are familiar with the scientific method, is that there is no good reason to displace Matthew as first. That's the null. And the hypothesis we're putting forth, that scholars bear the burden of putting forth, is that no, there actually is a good reason to displace Matthew in favor of Mark, and then they need to lay out the evidence for doing that. So, again, I want to be really clear. It's fine to challenge that default of Matthew. It's perfectly fine. But to do so, you have to now present affirmative evidence that makes us have good reason to reject that default and that testimony that's based on tradition in favor of something else. So let's look at what that is.
In general, the general belief is the argument from order. And the idea is when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, either in the synopsis or in Alan Barr's wonderful diagram of synoptic relationships, you can see that there are only about 30 verses out of over 600 verses of Mark. Only about 30 are not reproduced or reproduced in some way in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew or Luke. Also, Matthew and Luke are longer than Mark. Luke, by the way, is the longest document in the New Testament.
Okay, so let's pause here, because this repeats an argument, this argument from order, that is just been thoroughly and decisively debunked. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacious argument on its face. I'm just stunned that this argument has not been dismantled by the Academy. And by the way, this is one of my fundamental attacks on the Academy consensus, writ large. These are the kinds of arguments that should be discredited and immediately challenged. And the fact that they're not is a concern. The fact that this argument serves as the linchpin for Markan Priority, for the 90% consensus, is a real indictment of the Academy itself. I really try hard not to make these videos personal. I have nothing personal against any of these scholars. I really do not. And I respect them. I respect anybody who dedicates their life to any field and focusing on a subject matter and studying that subject matter. I think their arguments, though, are absolutely valid for attack, deserve to be mercilessly attacked where the evidence warrants that. There's no entitlement to any deference where the evidence warrants something else, no matter how decent the people are. And I think they're decent people. I really do. I say this over and over again, but I really do not think these are bad people at all. And I don't think they're foolish or dumb or anything like that. That's not at all what I believe. I think that there are some misguided arguments that I truly believe have of agendas that are things we can get into elsewhere. So let's look at this argument from order. And the statement here is that and again, even as it's framed, the vast majority of the text that is in Mark is copied into Matthew. Again, even that framing, right, suggests a bias, right? It suggests that it had to be Matthew that did the copying. And I've addressed this before in other videos, and I think it's just such a simplistic and easy argument to debunk, and it has. I'm not the first one to do it, but I want to spend some time here for those who haven't had a chance to look at it. So let me try to pull up this other video here. Okay, so in an earlier video I did here, there was an argument here that was presented by another biblical scholar. Again, and to be fair to him, he was not arguing this. In fact, he has the argument right. He's not arguing that this finding of so much of the text from Mark appearing in Matthew somehow means that Mark must have been first. He was not making an argument. He was pointing to the evidence that helps show literary dependence, and that's totally accurate. But if you look at some of these statements, and this is an analogous statement to the one we just heard, so the evidence for a documentary solution, so 660 verses in Mark, 600 of those verses appear in Matthew. 77% of Mark's words show up in Matthew, and 90% of Mark's verses. So I have a little diagram below this that shows a very simple illustration with a red pot and a green pot. And in the red pot, we have 2 sets of stories, and in the green pot, we have 3 sets of stories. And story 1 and story 2 are essentially identical in story content and in story word order to each other in each of the pots. And then there's this additional story that appears in pot 3. And so the question is, if you were to stumble across these pots, 1,000 years later, whenever, and you were to see these two different pots that have different stories but very similar in word order, very similar in text in each of the pots, could you conclude from looking at those which came first? It should be obvious to anyone with sort of just basic logical reasoning that you can't conclude which came first. It could be that the green pot came first, and the writer of the text in the red pot chose to, for whatever reason, not write anything about story number 3. It could also be that the writer of the green pot saw the red pot first and decided to add story 3 to it. There's just no way that one can look at this text and look at these findings and conclude either way that one came before the other. And again, I'm not here to argue that this argument from order proves that Matthew was first. I don't think that's argument flows from this either. In fact, it doesn't flow from this either. It's equally fallacious. But to argue that this appearance of so much of Mark in Matthew somehow argues that Mark was first is nakedly fallacious. And we need to be careful with arguments like this. If this is what the consensus is hinged on, and I've covered this is what the consensus originally hinged itself on, that's just a fallacy. So let's get back to the video and let's see here if we can hear a little bit more from the professor.
So also, when you look at Matthew and Mark, either Mark has to be first or Matthew has to be first. I think that goes without saying. And so it's either your only real choices that make any sense at all are Matthean priority, in other words, that Matthew was first, and Markan priority.
So let's just pause on that, because I think that statement is accurate for a number of reasons. Again, the candidates here are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The professor here is arguing that it can really only either be Matthew or Luke. It could really only be either Matthew or Mark that's first. And with respect to the argument from order, that's not true. It could be any of Luke, Matthew, or Mark first if it's purely the argument from order that you're relying on. However, there are other reasons, there are other analyses of Luke that are that exist outside of the argument from order, that make it less credible in totality that Luke could have come before either Matthew. Sorry, that make it less credible that Luke could have been the first of the three synoptic gospels. There are those who argue that. I don't want to say that there's no one out there that's arguing that, but that is an extremely minority position, and it's one that is extremely assumption laden, and so it is not the simplest explanation at all. And for a lot of reasons, again, as I've discussed in this channel, we try to stay away from layering on assumptions that we don't need if we can get to an answer without them. And I just want to be clear again: the synoptic problem is a logic problem. It is a documentary logic problem. None of the answers that can be put forth for addressing the synoptic problem can be definitively argued as being the actual facts of what happened. The actual facts of what happened here are likely myriad and complicated. But what we're trying to do as historians, as those who are looking at these texts, several years later, is to put together the most credible hypothesis, and the hypothesis that requires the least amount of assumptions, that helps us solve the riddle here of which of these came first. What I'm trying to establish here is that, which was a little bit of a tangent, but the point here is that it's either Matthew or Mark that was first. And I think that is probably the best approach here. If there are people who want to disagree with that, just put it in the comments and we can discuss. Let's move on.
With Markan priority, you have a much longer gospel, and yet when Matthew looks at Mark's miracle stories, Matthew abbreviates them and gets rid of some of the gory details, some of the more the details that might detract attention from the teaching of Jesus.
Okay, so again, here we are. The statement here is that Matthew is a much longer gospel. Again, I hope it's crystal clear. That proves absolutely nothing with respect to order. It's just completely fallacious. There's really no argument about that. That's not an opinion. So if you want to argue that, you're just wasting your breath. But the other argument is that Matthew appears to, for lack of a better word, sanitize some of the text from Mark. You can only reach that position if you already have the presupposition of which one was first. If your view is that Mark was first, and you're then looking at the parallel accounts in Matthew on these miracles, you're going to read them as some kind of watering down or changing or toning down from Matthew, from Mark. Okay, fine. But if you put Matthew first, and then you're looking at the parallel accounts in Mark, you will read them as Mark adding to, or potentially embellishing, or potentially giving more detail. In most of the accounts that are parallel between Matthew and Mark gives far more detail in the accounts that are parallel. So you're looking at it that way. Again, either is fine. They don't. Neither proves anything. That's the problem with circular arguments like these. They're circular. They don't prove anything one way or the other. I'm not saying that this argues for Mark or against Mark. I'm just saying it doesn't illustrate or help us get to an answer in either direction. So let's keep going here a little bit.
Also, Matthew tends to edit out some of the Latinisms and Aramaisms that Mark preserves.
Okay, on this point, so it says Matthew edits out Latinisms and Aramaisms that Mark preserves. So let's take a look at that. It's conceded that the Gospel of Mark has what's referred to as more Latinisms. Again, this is not my field, and I cannot sort of attest to this based on any work that I've done independently. This is something that I have accepted from papers that I've read. And so if there are others who challenge this, feel free to bring those arguments. But it's my understanding that Mark contains more Latinisms. It's also my understanding that Mark contains more Aramaisms, and that I have seen. And those Aramaisms, each of the ones that's included in Mark, is accompanied by a translation. So they're Aramaisms that are present in Mark, and then they're translated afterwards. This right here is being argued as evidence for Matthew coming after Mark. Matthew sees the Latinisms, takes them out. Matthew sees the Aramaisms and doesn't include them. Okay, again, this is a circular argument. I think you can see where this is going. If you look at it in the other direction, and the argument is that Matthew was first, you could argue that Mark came along later, and perhaps even at a time later where the church was actually beginning to expand into the more Latin regions of the world. And Mark, the writer of Mark, adds Latinisms because that writer is not writing from the old world, as you could say. You could also argue that that writer includes the Aramaisms and includes translations because the audience that Mark may have been writing to in this increasingly Latinized world may not have understood those Aramaisms without the translations. That may not have been true for Matthew, who, if Matthew was first, was likely writing earlier, was certainly writing earlier if we place Matthew first, at a time when maybe those translations weren't needed. And Matthew may not have included Latinisms because Matthew was writing at a time when the writers hadn't genuinely expanded out into the Latin world. Again, these are just hypotheses, but the point is, neither of those arguments flows necessarily from this data. It depends on which you choose to put first. So again, this is another problem with arguing for Markan Priority based on this. And mind you, these are the arguments that are used to knock us off of our default. These are the arguments that are used to challenge our null hypothesis. Okay, these aren't my arguments. These are the arguments that the Markan Priorities are putting forth as bases to say, this is why 90% of scholars agree that Mark was first. It's based on this stuff. So let's just move forward here just a little bit. And again, as I do with these other videos, I'm not going to go through the whole video. It's an hour-long video. It's worth watching on your own. Again, same with Jacob Berman. I think he's fine. I don't have any problem with him. And I think he is. I appreciate people like him who bring scholars like this on and discuss and let scholars share their work. I think it's great. So watch the whole video when you get a chance. I'll put the link in the description.
Also, Matthew and Luke are widely thought of to be in better Greek than Mark is in.
So again, on this point, it's not my area. It's not my expertise. I'm not familiar with any of the classical languages. I'm not familiar with classical Latin or classical Greek or Hebrew. I do speak other languages, but that's neither here nor there. The point here, though, is that if you place Mark or Matthew first, and then you say Mark came along and copied from Matthew, it appears that Mark did so in a way that uses inferior Greek. I'll just accept that point as being true. As again, because I cannot independently verify it myself. I try to verify all these things myself with my own work and go read the papers, but things where I don't have any expertise and I'm not going to have expertise, I'll just accept when I come to believe here's a mainstream view. I know that might seem contradictory here because I am challenging consensus in other ways, but where I can't do anything more than that, I have no choice but to just accept that this is true. So I'll accept that Mark's Greek is worse. So the argument could be, why would someone with Matthew must be first, because why would someone come and see Matthew's Greek and then copy it into worse Greek? Okay, I mean, sure, if that's an argument you want to make, fine. But I could just as easily take it the other way around and say Matthew could have been first, writing in good Greek at a time where it was truly in a Hellenic environment where Greek was, much better understood and much better written. And Mark was writing in a later environment where the writer of Mark may not have been as proficient in Greek, may have been more proficient in Latin, may have been more proficient in another language. Again, this is not. We're not arguing that one is better than the other. These are circular arguments. It just depends on which one you put first. But to say that this is what the consensus that's been built, this 90% consensus that is being used to discredit the null position here, that it's Matthew that's first. This is the reason. It's really tough, folks. And again, this is the scholar's work. This is not my work. So if they have arguments, they bear the burden of sharing them with us. And I think that's what this scholar is trying to do here. Let's just spend a little more time, and then we'll try to wrap up here. This video's pushing up on 30 minutes.
As I believe, Mark has a kind of an unremitting attitude toward the apostles, that the apostles are really pretty much schmoes. I mean, they just... there are only two problems with the apostles. They're unfaithful, and they just don't get what Jesus is saying much of the time. And that is the overall attitude of the Gospel of Mark about the apostles.
All right, I'm going to use this. I'm going to wrap up with this particular point. As I said, please go watch the video, support History Valley. Again, I think the channel, I disagree with a lot of the stuff that comes on there, but to be fair, I think the channel does a fair job of trying to cover this topic from a wide variety of angles. So you should go support the channel and look at this video in more detail. But what I will say here is that this is yet another example of, it depends on which you view first. Right. If you view Matthew as first, you'll look at this argument here about the view of the apostles differently than if you put Mark first. We can do this over and over again. I think that point is clear. So essentially what we have here are two arguments, and I'll wrap up with this here. We have two arguments being put forth by this professor for why Mark is first. The first is this argument from order. It's a terrible argument. It's bad, and it deserves no credit. And no one who continues to really argue this seriously, for example, Professor Mark Goodacre, his students, other scholars. I'm sorry, I'm drawing blanks on some of the names. They don't argue the argument from order anymore. They concede that it's a bad argument. It's bad. So, guys, it shouldn't be used. But one of these arguments is the argument from order. The second argument is the argument that can be summarized as criticisms of the quote-unquote redaction profile of the writer of Mark. And the argument here broadly is, if the writer of Mark was to come after Matthew and or Luke, how could that writer have done the different things that writer would have done? That writer would have written a shorter gospel. That writer would have written a gospel that what was the word I used earlier? Sanitized, that sort of unsanitized some of the work from Matthew. That writer would have omitted some different accounts. For example, the nativity. and other arguments like that. I've done a whole video on this. I'll link that in here too on the criticisms of that. But these are the two principal arguments: is that the redaction profile for the writer of Mark doesn't make sense if that writer came after Matthew and or Luke for a number of reasons. Again, I've covered this extensively in another video. I'll link it in the description. That argument really is weak. I don't want to say it's wrong, but it's really weak, and it's reversible, and it's circular. Lots of problems with it. And then the final argument is this argument from editorial fatigue. And again, something I've covered in other videos. This is an argument that the chief proponent is Professor Mark Goodacre, brilliant professor, humble person, wickedly smart, knows these issues 1,000 times better than I ever will. None of this is about Professor Goodacre himself. He walks circles around me or anyone else for that matter, from what I've seen in the field. He's aces in every other way. But this argument on editorial fatigue is really bad, and it's a circular argument because it depends on what you have to use the point of view that you already have about what's first in order to find the fatigue. Again, I've covered this. I'll link that in the description as well. It's also reversible. There's evidence, and I've done extensive work on this, of this argument going in the exact other way, where it appears if you were to place Matthew first, you could argue that Mark is fatiguing against Matthew, or Mark is fatiguing against Luke. It's unequivocal. The argument is just baseless. It shouldn't be used. It's not a good argument. It never was a good argument. The Academy never challenged the obvious circularity problem. The circularity problem alone is problematic. It doesn't mean that editorial fatigue is wrong. It just means it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove it's circular and it's reversible, so it doesn't have any probative value at all. And so those are the three basic arguments: argument from order, Mark's redaction profile, and editorial fatigue. And they're all really bad. And if you don't have to take my word for it, you can look this up for yourself. You can look at my previous videos. You can look at other channels like Faith Because of Reason who've covered this, and others who've done this work. And you can, and I'll link Faith Because of Reason as well, who's done a whole analysis on this. Additionally, to show that the argument here, those three arguments, argument from order, Mark's redaction profile, and editorial fatigue, just completely do not do enough for us to get to a consensus. The fact that there's a consensus of Markan Priority based on these arguments is concerning. It should raise everyone's antenna that something else is going on here. And again, I don't know what it is. I really don't. I have theories, but there's no point. It's obvious that something else is going on. This can't, because with this kind of data in any other field, there would at least be discord and disagreement. There couldn't be consensus if this is the evidence that's being used to get to that consensus. So I'll wrap up. I think I've gone on pretty long here. I encourage you to look at videos that I've done that are based on an extensive amount of work, where I've looked at the evidence that's been given to me, and see what you think. And if I've missed something, or I'm not getting something, I'm missing the best argument, I'm missing the killer argument, again, the archaeological evidence or the historical evidence or some other thing that just kind of proves this in the other direction, please provide that. I will update it. I'm an honest person. I will be clear if there's something that I've missed. But based on the three arguments that I've come across, the case for Markan Priority is terrible. It's deeply concerning, and we need to hold the Academy accountable for how they got here. Thanks.